This is the caption reads, "We do better work here, 5-year-old Kingsley." Now, what am I talking about? I went to a special Black Saturday school called the Winnie Mandela School, as you can see from the news now. And one of the great ironies of colonialism is that the schools set up in the Caribbean and Africa and Asia under British rule were schools designed to produce a middle-class bureaucracy capable of governing the colony, albeit governing in Britain's interests. And in a sense, a lot of people from the Caribbean and Asia and Africa came to Britain expecting to find a higher standard of education than what they got back home. And that isn't what they got. They ended up in state schools where working class white kids were being taught to get jobs in factories that no longer exist. And in many senses, there was a lower level of academic expectation than what they would have had in selective schools back home, quote unquote. So for example, in Jamaica, very, very unequal society, deeply classist society, but the schools in Jamaica still operate on an old school, grammar school style system where essentially the cleverest children get apportioned places at the best schools. And what this has led to, ironically in Jamaica, is a situation where the top private school is largely seen by many people, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but this is the truth, is largely seen as basically a school for rich kids who weren't smart enough to get into the top state school. Right? The top performing school in Jamaica, a school called Campion College, it is a state school, has like 100% A-level pass rate, like very, very good school if you can get into it. And what this meant was people set up these kinds of Pan-African Saturday schools to encourage children like me to work hard at school or get help with your maths and English or learn African history. Again, a whole part of Black British history that lots of people don't know about and lots of people are very, very shocked about. And many of you would find, if you talk to a lot of African and Caribbean people of my sort of age group who are successful today, you'll be shocked how many of them came out of this Black Saturday school movement. We have a chapter called Scotland and Jamaica. I always tell people I'm half Scottish, half Jamaican. It's not actually true, I'm only a quarter Scottish, but hey, my granddad wasn't very pleasant, so we sort of go. But what was interesting to me is I visited only Scotland and Jamaica one time as a child. I've been to both scores of times since, but I learned very, very different things about race and class in each place, right? My Scottish family were much more accepting of my mother. In fact, I got the distinct impression they dislike English people way more than they dislike anybody brown, right? And my Scottish cousins would always say to me, "So are you Catholic or are you Protestant?" That's what they wanted to know, right? In fact, I joke because I got Muslim friends in Glasgow, and they always tell me growing up it would be the same thing. They'd say, kids would say to them, "Are you Catholic or are you Protestant?" And they say, "No, I'm Muslim." And the Scottish kids would go, "Yeah, is that Catholic or Protestant?" Like, which one is that? Pick, right? And so again, you learn that ethnicity and religion and other forms of conflict exist but race. In fact, I went to the Outer Hebrides where my mum's family come from, a tiny island called Benbecula. And one of my little cousins, she was like 7, completely innocently, there was no malice at all, so I don't mean to give the sense that there was that. She literally said to me like "Why are you brown?" Like, my daddy said it's because of the sun, right? She wasn't far off the truth. But what was interesting to me, it was abundantly clear that it was literally just fascination, there was no malice. So I suppose my conclusion, even as a young child, I was like, oh, racism really is learned behaviour. The kids I've gone to school with who think that way, their parents have taught them to think that way. Here are children who've been exposed to a completely different set of ideas and they think very, very differently. What's interesting in Jamaica, the racial classification worked very, very differently. People of mixed heritage, for a very long time in Jamaica, were allowed to own property, allowed to own land, even allowed to own slaves. And so, or enslaved people rather. And so, what used to be called politically incorrectly in the Caribbean mulattoes, but in Jamaica they still often sadly call high colour, which is a revealing phrase, right? People refer to someone of my complexion, much more so in Trinidad even than other countries in the Caribbean, but even in Jamaica, someone having a high colour, because there is this different colour gradation, or brown man, and it's a different social class. And you look around the Caribbean, it's changing, but you still see very disproportionately people of lighter skin in their jobs, and living in nicer areas, a disproportionate amount of wealth and so on, because the colour caste hierarchy is very, very different in the Caribbean. So if you talk to somebody like John Barnes, for example, his family back in the Caribbean were upper middle class, educated, high flyers. He comes to England, people throw monkey skins at him, and they find it hard to process because back home they were in a privileged class. So you learn that race and class operate very, very differently in different parts of the world and different countries. Since then I've travelled to South Africa where you have a whole group of people called coloured who have a whole different range of looks, but they get lumped into one big category called coloured. You go to Australia and you meet Australian Aborigines, because this thing called the stolen generation, who to me and you would look, there's no way to put it, we would think they were white. They look white because they've got, maybe a white parent, or maybe they're mixed, or what, but because of this system of breeding that the Australian government had, forced breeding, but they will still tell you they're black. They call them black fellas out there, and they've had a racialized experience that in many ways is much worse than, say, a black immigrant from Nigeria who's very well educated. I use this example because I've got a friend who's a very successful Nigerian immigrant in Australia doing very, very well, has a great time, and in a way Australians would be embarrassed to treat him the way Aborigines are often treated. And so race often doesn't even work on a simple basis of skin colour. Racialization is much more complicated than that. I'm going to try and speed up a little bit because that's where I'm starting to run over. Next slide. Police, peers and teenagers. Again, sorry, this is me showing off a little bit, I have to admit. The gentleman next to the goalkeeper, the one with the screw face, the really, really angry looking guy to your right of the goalkeeper, that's actually me. So I played for West Ham as a schoolboy. That's Anton Ferdinand at the front, by the way, for anyone who's into football. And I use this because, I don't know, maybe just I enjoyed being a teenager, I love playing football, whatever. But again, this chapter we try and talk about the challenges. I like to challenge people to think a little bit differently. Lots of people have this idea that only certain types of young boys get involved in what maybe today we would call gang crime, or violence, or problems and troubles. And I don't fit the profile. I was a straight A student my entire childhood. I played almost professional football, but ongoing with all of that, the first time I saw somebody get stabbed, I was 12. It was very, very bad and quite traumatic in hindsight now. Spent the first 2 years of secondary school. My mum was very, very sick with cancer. You're going to school dealing with that kind of stress. It's easy when you live in a certain type of neighborhood or you're exposed to certain type of things. One bad decision, one friend gets in a fight, all of a sudden, now you're in prison. Everybody maybe didn't grow up that way, likes to think it's just this type of boy. And what I try to go through in this chapter is not just being a black boy in inner city London, but then I contrast that with, which some of you maybe have seen me do in interviews, contrast that with, say, Glasgow. And this is where we see how race and class is explained differently. Still today, Glasgow has a higher murder rate than London. Glasgow has worse deprivation than London. Glasgow has a lower life expectancy than London. The class inequality in Glasgow is absolutely atrocious and has been for a very, very long time. And that story is very much interlinked with the story of British colonialism in Ireland and the migration of Irish Catholics to Glasgow. In many respects, it actually mirrors some of what happened with Caribbean people in London, or later arriving African immigrants in London and so on. But if you look at the way our media presents those two stories and the way we're taught to understand those two different issues surrounding young men, it's very, very, very different. There is a heavy class contempt, of course, in the Glaswegian case, with people from those areas being referred to as schemies and all this sort of stuff. So it's very clear there is a class contempt, but it's never explained primarily through the lens of race. And what's interesting to me is, someone who's, I've watched my whole generation of musicians, including rappers, become quite successful. So I've watched the man become middle class. I hate to break it to you, like all of your favorite road rappers, they live in the countryside, their kids go private school, right? So I've watched man change as they've got some money. I'm like, oh shit, who knew? Black people are just like everybody else. The moment they're exposed to different things, they make different choices. Who knew? And so I try and give a sort of materialist explanation, not an excuse, just an explanation and understanding of inner city gang violence, over-incarceration, some of the problems of being a teenage boy, a teenage black boy in London. The Ku Klux Klan stopped crime by killing black people. Sadly, this is something a teacher actually said to me in the midst of an argument in my secondary school. Because I'm running slow on time, I'm not going to give you the whole story. You'll have to read the chapter for that one. But again, I use this chapter and what this teacher said and the way the school dealt with her. I was a proper busybody. I wrote a petition and everything. I went around the school getting people to sign the petition. Thank you. Nothing happened to her. In fact, she got promoted. But I wish I was joking, I really do. And I actually went to quite a good school. That's the irony of it all. But I then go into some really detailed studies, including studies that looked at data from every single secondary school in the country, showing that the way, it isn't just my imagination, the way that race and class biases come out in the way we treat children in school. So for example, surprisingly, and this is the one study I'll highlight, Warwick University did some data on every single school in England where they looked at how children scored in measured testing and they looked at how they were being assessed in the classroom and they compared these two things. What they found was quite fascinating. They didn't find simply a white-black racism, and that isn't me letting anyone off the hook. What they found was a little bit more complex than that. They found that the only two groups of children that teachers overestimate, i.e. They score here, and teachers assume even here, was Indian and Chinese children, which isn't surprising. They are the two top performing groups, but we now know that teachers see an Indian or Chinese face and they just, oh, you must be super smart, and they mark them up. And that's perhaps a good stereotype, but what about for Indian and Chinese children who are struggling? It may mean they're not getting the help they need or assistance they need. What they then found was for white people, class made an enormous difference. More middle class children, and we all know how to assess class markers. We're a very classist society. If a young person talks a certain way, or maybe they're on free school meals, or maybe their clothes aren't as nice. In fact, actually, we all know, posh kids at school often dressed down, so often that was a class marker actually. But we all know how to assess those things, and teachers massively under-assess working class white children relative to their intelligence. The saddest part of the study, however, though, was that for black children, social class made no difference whatsoever, and ethnicity made no difference whatsoever. What do I mean by that? First generation African immigrant kids are actually doing extremely well in school. Black English kids whose great-grandparents came from the Caribbean, who in my view are not meaningfully culturally Caribbean anymore unless they spend time in the Caribbean and visit regularly, are not doing very well. But this didn't make any difference. Right? Teachers under-assessed these two groups very, very similarly, even though British Nigerians are doing excellently and British Jamaicans are not doing excellently. These are ethnically different groups with different histories, but more importantly, different class backgrounds, because of course, middle-class children in Jamaica are doing fine in school, poor children not. The same class dynamics play out. And what we can do about that, I put a few suggestions in there for what we can do. Last few slides, and I will go quickly. Empire and slavery in the British memory. I go through the way in which I was taught the history of colonialism to the extent that I was taught in school. And basically all I was taught was that William Wilberforce stopped slavery, and that was the end of it. And even after, since I wrote Natives, which I didn't know at the time, and I really wish I did, and it speaks to the biased way historiography is written, that even I, someone who spent much of my adult life reading about these subjects, didn't know what I'm about to tell you. But in the 1680s, 100 years before what is commonly called the abolitionist movement, an exiled Angolan prince named Lorenzo Mendoza da Silva fought a 2-year court case at the Vatican. He could speak Latin and Greek and so on, so he went to the Vatican. He argued at the Vatican. He was supported by 2 Spanish friars. He argued explicitly for the abolition of slavery. And temporarily, the Vatican did actually abolish slavery in the 1680s. How does this never figure in history that an exiled Angolan prince went all the way to the Vatican and made a whole legal court case, not just about the abolition of slavery, but about the oppression of indigenous Americans and converted Christians in the New World, i.e. Jewish people who'd been expelled from Spain and sent to the New World and been forced to convert to Christianity. You can read about all this. He's a Brazilian scholar. I'm not going to mispronounce his name, just Google it and then you'll look at Lorenzo Mendoza da Silva's page and you'll find the scholar's book, because there's only one scholar who's really written about it. But it speaks to the way in which history is taught through a very filtered lens. Britain and America, I think this is very apt, given that the orange man keeps telling our government what to do, and we keep following a country that still doesn't have healthcare, as if it's some sort of model anyone should aspire to, and starts a war every other week, and our government follows them, irrespective of whether the British public supports or is interested in or wants to be shaped by those ideas. The democratic deficit between what the British public believes and what the British government does should very much concern everyone, and the fact that American companies, American tech companies, American arms companies can control our political decision-making process should really, really scare the pants off of everybody. As we've seen, people grandmothers being arrested for holding placards. We really may be witnessing the end of Britain as a democratic society. And in no small part, to the extent that we are a democratic society, in no small part it would be because we follow rather supinely every single decision that's made in America, including, of course, what we've seen recently with Jason Arde in the context of the American pushback on what they call DEI, right? The idea that you should try and cast the net a little bit wider and try and give other people opportunities too, because of a very long history, in America's case, of literal formal apartheid till like the other day. And the massive right-wing pushback against that is the context in which people can be hounded in the way that Jason Hardy was hounded. Now, whatever the facts of the case are, to be honest, I do not know fully. I just know that other people in the same situation have not been treated similarly, and it has to be in that context. And very last slide. Does anyone know, if you can shout, only people who haven't read the book, what is this image? Does anyone know? This is the last slide, so I will go because I know someone's about to start now. Only people who haven't read the book. So these women are the scientists that worked on the Indian mission to Mars that sent a rocket to Mars for 10% of the cost that NASA can send a rocket to Mars. Right? So shout out to them. I probably should have put up there. I probably should have put up there the decline of sexism as well, question mark, right? And I say that to say this. When we say the decline of whiteness, let's be clear, just in case, I presume we're in an audience that's, well-read and cultured and knows what I mean by that. We don't mean the decline of white people, we mean the decline of the idea of innate white superiority. And ironically, all the things that white people have to give up to pretend to be part of this, banner of whiteness that is much more codified in somewhere like America. In Europe, it's a little bit more complicated because people now have ethnic groups and religions. And you go to the Basque region, the Basque people see themselves as white first or Basque first, somebody Basque first, and so on and so forth. All of these sorts of things, but thinking about a world in which scientists don't look one way. I've got nothing but love for, Roger Penrose or Isaac Newton or people of this nature from whom I've learned and who've been inspiring. But for most of human history, the scientists in the world were not only in Europe. They were in India, they were in the Middle East, they were in Africa, people who were innovating in medicine and surgery and optics and all these things. If you read widely enough, you know that. We are now returning to a world in which the image of a scientist may look like this. Also, there are people in the world. There are lots of people in the world, and in this country, young men in particular, sadly, who are being propagandized to resent this, even though the human knowledge benefits cumulatively from this. And instead of young men, particularly young working class men, being encouraged to study harder, to have higher aspirations, and I don't mean that in a sort of pull yourself up by the bootstraps, I mean literally society having higher expectations of young working class men, encouraging them to read more, encouraging them to do better and be better. Young working class men are being propagandized to, often by very powerful, very wealthy American tech companies, to believe that women being successful or brown people in any position of power is basically the end of the universe, rather than a return to the world as it's been for most of human history. Prior to 1500, we had what's called, there's actually a great book written by a very conservative American scholar, ironically, called Return to Marco Polo's World. And what's interesting is, even though it's very, very conservative, it's very clear, in Marco Polo's world, Europe was not the center of the world. Marco Polo went to China and went, bomba clot, right? He was very, very shocked at what China was building and the complications and level of advance of Chinese civilization. And he in no way thought, I'm European, I'm superior to Chinese people. It was evident to him that at that point in human history, China was much more advanced. We now live in a world where, in many respects, technologically speaking, China has returned to some version of that position, as has Japan and South Korea and Singapore and a number of countries in Asia. Now we can either prepare young people in the West for that world and see it as a world of cooperation, as a world that could be fruitful, a world where you can learn other people's languages the way they've always learned yours, a world of opportunity where you can go and work in India or China or Singapore. Or we can do what lots of people are currently doing and encourage them to resent a world that they cannot stop from emerging. They don't have the power to stop from emerging. But sadly, in the process of trying to prevent that, they can cause immense suffering for a great, great many people. I want to leave you with a quote from one of my favorite writers, a man called James Baldwin, who I'm sure you've all heard of, and for something for us to all think about when we're having these difficult discussions and trying to organize and trying to push back against some of the more unpleasant things that are occurring. And Baldwin said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Thank you very much, people. Have a big and great rest of the festival. Thank you so much. Take care.
I don't think we'll get to go around the back.